It is the year of our Lord 1821, and King George IV is having a bit of a wardrobe malfunction. Not just a forgot to zip up his fly kind of malfunction, this is a structural, architectural, full-blown, sartorial catastrophe. The man is, to put it politely, a unit. He is a sphere of self-indulgence poured into a human-shaped container, and that container is currently being squeezed, cinched, and otherwise brutalized by an army of tailors who are trying to make him look less like a beached whale and more like a king for his coronation. The centerpiece of this effort is a corset, a royal corset made of the finest whalebone and desperation, designed to compress the king's magnificent gut into something resembling a regal silhouette. As they pull the laces tighter, there is a sound not unlike a ship's mast snapping in a gale. It is the sound of royal cartilage giving up the ghost. The king lets out a wheeze. He is turning a shade of purple that hasn't been seen in nature since the last dodo realized it was the last dodo. But the show must go on. The crown is waiting. This scene, in all its bloated, creaking, sweaty absurdity, is the British monarchy in miniature. It is an ancient, solemn institution wrestling with the deeply silly, fleshy, and often incompetent reality of the human beings who wear the crown. It is about immense power and prestige being entrusted to people who, on any given day, might be more concerned with the fit of their pants or a particularly nasty bout of gout. This whole grand, sprawling, thousand-year story of conquest and civil war, of high treason and low comedy, of earth-shattering decisions and monumentally stupid mistakes, all of it ultimately comes down to a succession of very flawed people in very fancy hats. And if that whole situation, a man nearly exploding in a corset on his way to be anointed by God, feels a little familiar, a little bit like we have seen this blend of high ceremony and low farce before, well, it should. Because this is a story that happens over and over and over again. To understand why this keeps happening, we need to go back, way back. Back before the corsets, before the palaces, before even the idea of Britain was much more than a geographical suggestion. Let us set the stage. The place is a damp, perpetually overcast island off the coast of Europe. Its inhabitants for centuries have had one primary characteristic. They get invaded. A lot. It's the island's main hobby. First, the Romans showed up, built some very straight roads, some nice baths, complained about the weather for 400 years, and then abruptly left when their own empire started having a going-out-of-business sale. They left behind a bunch of confused Romano-Britons who had forgotten how to defend themselves. This was like a giant neon sign flashing vacancy over the English Channel. So naturally a bunch of Germanic dudes with names like Hengist and Horsa, who sound less like founding fathers and more like a comedy duo, showed up. These were the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. They sailed over in longboats, took one look at the place, and decided it was a definite upgrade from their own damp patch of northern Europe. What followed was several centuries of what historians call the Heptarchy, which is a fancy Greek word for a seven-way royal rumble. England was not one kingdom. It was a chaotic patchwork of competing kingdoms: Wessex, Sussex, Essex, Kent, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. Saying you were the king of England back then was like declaring yourself the king of the food court. Sure, you might have dominion over the Sbarro and the Cinnabon, but the guy over at Panda Express does not recognize your authority and is currently sharpening a spork. These Anglo-Saxon kings spent their time doing three things: farming, fighting each other, and converting to Christianity, often in that order and sometimes all at once. They built wooden halls, drank a lot of mead, and listened to long poems about heroes slaying monsters, which was probably a welcome distraction from the fact that their neighbor, King Ethel something or other, was currently burning their village to the ground over a stolen pig. Into this chaotic, mead-soaked mosh pit sailed a new group of tourists: the Vikings. The Vikings were like the Anglo-Saxons, but with better boats and worse manners. Their business model was simple: show up, smash the place, take everything that wasn't nailed down, and then nail down the women and take them too. For a century, they treated the English coastline like a drive-through ATM. The Anglo-Saxons, particularly the monks whose monasteries were filled with lovely portable gold things, were not fans. They wrote angry chronicles describing the Vikings as heathens sent by God to punish them for their sins, which was probably a more comforting thought than, "We are being repeatedly robbed by Norwegians because our coastal defense budget is zero." This endless cycle of raiding and mayhem was finally challenged by one man, Alfred the Great. Alfred was the king of Wessex, and he was great for one simple reason. He was the first Anglo-Saxon king to figure out that if you want to stop Vikings, you need to fight them like Vikings. He built a navy. He fortified towns into a network of burhs, which were basically panic rooms for entire communities. He fought the Vikings to a standstill and then did something truly clever. He made a deal. He drew a line on the map of England and told the Viking leader, Guthrum, that everything on one side was his, the Danelaw, and everything on the other side was Alfred's. This was a brilliant piece of management. It turned a bunch of chaotic raiders into neighbors. Annoying, loud neighbors who still occasionally tried to steal your sheep, but neighbors nonetheless. Alfred also learned to read, which was a huge flex for a king in the 9th century, and sponsored the translation of books into English, kickstarting the idea of a common English identity. He had effectively laid the groundwork for a unified Kingdom of England. So the stage is set. We have the foundational ingredients for our repeating cycle. First, you have the Anglo-Saxon political structure, which is basically a bunch of powerful, grumpy nobles called earls who all think they should be in charge. Second, you have the church, a massive international corporation with its own laws, its own land, and a direct line to God, which it is not afraid to use to get what it wants. Third, you have the lingering Viking presence in the north, a constant reminder that things can always get worse. And fourth, you have the English Channel, a strip of water that is just wide enough to make the English feel special and isolated, but not wide enough to stop a guy with enough boats and a bad attitude. All you need now is a succession crisis and a dude with a bad attitude. History, ever the helpful showrunner, was about to provide both. The year is 1066. The king is Edward the Confessor. He is called the Confessor because he was extremely pious, spent all his time praying, and most importantly for our story, had apparently decided that the best way to show his devotion to God was to not have sex with his wife. This was great for his soul, but terrible for the long-term stability of the kingdom. Dying without a clear heir is the political equivalent of leaving a lit stick of dynamite on the dinner table and walking out of the room. As Edward lay on his deathbed, 3 different men were sharpening their swords and rehearsing their "actually I should be king" speeches. Contender number 1 was Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England. He was English, he was popular, he was right there in the room, and he claimed that Edward, with his dying breath, had pointed at him and mumbled something that sounded a lot like, "You're the king now, buddy." The assembled English nobles, faced with the choice between the guy they knew and some foreigners, shrugged and said, "Works for us." Harold was crowned king almost before Edward's body was cold. He had the crown, the throne, and the home field advantage. Contender number 2 was Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway. His name literally meant hard ruler, which was not a nickname you got for being good at watercolors. He was a 7-foot-tall Viking warrior poet who had spent his youth as a mercenary in the Byzantine Empire, which is the historical equivalent of being in the special forces. His claim to the English throne was to be charitable, creatively assembled from a series of old, half-forgotten deals between previous Viking and English kings. It was the kind of claim that makes no sense on paper, but makes a lot of sense when it's being shouted at you by a 7-foot-tall Viking with an axe. He saw the chaos in England as a perfect opportunity to reboot the whole Viking King of England franchise. And then there was contender number 3, William, the Duke of Normandy. And here we meet the man who will set the template for the entire British monarchy for the next 1,000 years. William was the illegitimate son of the previous Duke of Normandy, which earned him the delightful childhood nickname William the Bastard. This is not the sort of nickname that leads to a well-adjusted personality. William had spent his entire life fighting his own rebellious nobles, fighting the King of France, fighting the general perception that he was just some upstart with a questionable bloodline. He was tough. He was ruthless, he was deeply insecure, and he had the best organized army in Europe. His claim was that years earlier, King Edward the Confessor, his cousin, had promised him the throne. He also claimed that Harold Godwinson himself had once been shipwrecked in Normandy, and in exchange for being rescued, had sworn a holy oath on sacred relics to support William's claim. Whether any of this was true is debatable, but William had decided it was true, and he had the Pope's official blessing, a papal banner, to prove it. He was not just invading, he was conducting a holy mission to get a shiny hat. So in the autumn of 1066, England found itself in the worst possible situation, a 3-way death match for the crown. Harold Godwinson, the man in the middle, had to perform a miracle of medieval logistics. First, news arrived that Harald Hardrada and his Viking horde had landed in the north of England. Harold force-marched his army 200 miles in less than a week, which is an incredible feat when your army is mostly guys on foot who have been pulled away from their farms. He surprised the Vikings at Stamford Bridge, and in a brutal, bloody battle, he utterly destroyed them. Harald Hardrada, the 7-foot-tall terror of the north, was killed by an arrow to the throat. It was a stunning victory. Harold Godwinson had just secured his kingdom and seen off the last great Viking invasion of England. He probably allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, maybe a nice cup of mead. And then 3 days later, a messenger arrived, breathless and covered in dust. He had some bad news. William the Bastard had just landed on the south coast, with a lot of horses. Harold had just saved England from one invasion, and now he had to turn around and march his exhausted, battered army another 250 miles south to face another one. It is one of history's greatest for crying out loud moments. On October 14, 1066, the two armies met on a low ridge near the town of Hastings. Harold's army, the English, were on foot. They were tired, but they had the high ground. Their plan was simple and effective. Form a wall of interlocking shields, the shield wall, and let the Normans smash themselves against it. William's army was a different beast. It was a modern, combined arms force of archers, infantry, and, crucially, cavalry, knights, armored tanks on horseback. The battle raged all day. The Norman knights charged up the hill, and the English shield wall held firm. They could not break it. The Norman arrows arced over, clattering uselessly against the shields. For hours, William's fancy European army was getting nowhere against a wall of exhausted farmers with axes. At some point, a rumor spread through the Norman lines that William had been killed. His troops started to panic and fall back. This was the moment. If the English had just stayed put, they might have won. But seeing the Normans retreat, some of them broke formation and charged down the hill in triumph. William, who was very much not dead, saw his chance. He lifted his helmet to show his face, rallied his men, and turned his cavalry on the now exposed Englishmen, cutting them to pieces. He saw that a feigned retreat could break the unbreakable wall, so he did it again and again. The Norman knights would charge, pretend to flee, and when the English chased them, the knights would turn and destroy them. It was a dirty trick, but it worked. The shield wall began to shrink. As evening fell, Harold Godwinson, King of England for all of 9 months, looked up at the sky and met a Norman arrow with his eye. Or so the story goes. The Bayeux Tapestry, the magnificent piece of Norman propaganda that tells the story of the conquest, shows a figure with an arrow in his head next to the name Harold. It also shows a guy getting cut down by a knight's sword right next to him. Maybe both happened. The point is, he was very, very dead. With their king gone, the English resistance collapsed. William the Bastard had won. He marched to London, and on Christmas Day, 1066, in Westminster Abbey, he was crowned King of England. During the ceremony, the Norman knights outside heard the English inside cheering for their new king. Not understanding English, they assumed a riot was starting and did what came naturally to them. They set fire to the surrounding houses. The coronation of the first Norman king of England took place in a smoke-filled church to the sounds of his new subjects screaming as their homes burned down. It was a fitting start to the new regime. So begins Cycle 1. The template is established. A foreign power invades and takes over. The new king, William the Conqueror as he was now known, had a problem. He was one French-speaking duke sitting on top of an entire country of angry English-speaking people who did not want him there. His solution was brutal, simple, and effective. He replaced the entire ruling class. He systematically dispossessed almost every single Anglo-Saxon lord and gave their lands to his own Norman barons. This was not just a change of king, it was a hostile takeover of the entire country. He dotted the landscape with castles, not the pretty fairy tale castles of later years, but grim, functional wooden towers on mounds of earth called mottes. These were not defensive structures. They were instruments of occupation. They were fortresses built not to keep invaders out, but to keep the locals down. A castle was a permanent stony middle finger pointed at the conquered population. To make sure he knew exactly what he had conquered and how much he could squeeze out of it, William commissioned the most ambitious, terrifying, and frankly impressive piece of accounting in medieval history, the Domesday Book. He sent his agents to every village, every town, every farm in England and had them record everything. How many pigs, how many plows, how much land, who owned it before 1066 and who owned it now. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a contemporary account, complained that not one hide nor 1 yard of land, nor even, it is a shame to tell, though it seemed to him no shame to do, an ox, nor a cow, nor a pig was left that was not set down in his writing. They called it the Domesday Book because its judgment was as final as Judgment Day. There was no appeal. It was a complete inventory of his new company, and it told him exactly where all the money was. William was not a nice man. When the north of England rose up in rebellion, he responded with an event so brutal it became known as the Harrying of the North. He marched his army up there and systematically destroyed everything. He burned villages, slaughtered livestock, and salted the earth. Famine followed. Contemporary chroniclers describe people resorting to cannibalism. The region was so devastated it did not recover for centuries. The message was clear: obey or be erased. William ruled England for 21 years, and he ruled it with an iron fist, a sharp sword, and a very, very good ledger. He died in 1087, not in glorious battle, but from an injury sustained when his horse reared up in front of a burning town in France and threw him against the pommel of his saddle. His magnificent gut, which had grown considerably over the years, was ruptured. He lingered for weeks before finally dying. His servants, seeing that the gravy train had hit the buffers, immediately looted his chambers, stealing everything, right down to the clothes on his corpse, and leaving his naked body on the floor. When they finally got around to his funeral, his bloated body had swollen so much it wouldn't fit in the stone sarcophagus they'd built for him. They tried to shove it in anyway. It burst. The assembled mourners were treated to the horrific stench of a ruptured, putrefying king. It was a deeply undignified end for a man who had prized control above all else. Now comes the next phase of the cycle, the messy succession. William the Conqueror, for all his brutal efficiency, had set up a family drama that would plague England for decades. He had 3 sons who survived him: Robert Curthose, William Rufus, and Henry. Robert, the eldest, was a decent fighter but a terrible administrator. His nickname, Curthose, meant short stockings, which gives you a sense of the level of respect he commanded. William Rufus, the middle son, was his father's favorite. Rufus meant the red, probably for his ruddy complexion. He was a tough, cynical, and utterly godless soldier who enjoyed fighting and hunting and not much else. Henry, the youngest, was nicknamed Beauclerc, or good scholar, because he could read and write without moving his lips. He was clever, patient, and completely ruthless. On his deathbed, William the Conqueror made a classic bad parenting move. He split the inheritance. He gave the main family business, the Duchy of Normandy, to his eldest, Robert, but he gave the shiny new acquisition, the Kingdom of England, to his favorite, William Rufus. He gave his youngest son, Henry, a big pile of cash and basically told him to go buy himself something nice. This was a recipe for disaster. It was like giving one son the house, one son the car, and the third son a gift card to Applebee's. It guaranteed they would spend the rest of their lives fighting over it. And that is exactly what they did. William II, now King of England, and his brother Robert, Duke of Normandy, immediately started plotting against each other. The Norman barons, who now had lands on both sides of the Channel, were caught in the middle. They had to choose which brother to support, which was a nightmare. It was like your parents getting a divorce and asking you to pick which one you want to live with. Except if you pick wrong, the other one burns down your house. For 13 years, the brothers fought, made treaties, broke treaties, and generally made life miserable for everyone around them. Robert was perpetually broke and mortgaged Normandy to William Rufus so he could go on the First Crusade, which he saw as a great opportunity for some divinely sanctioned violence and looting. William Rufus ruled England with the same cheerful brutality as his father, but without any of the piety. He despised the church, which he viewed as a rival business that didn't pay its taxes. When the Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, annoyed him, William Rufus just seized all his lands and exiled him. He used the church's vast wealth as his personal slush fund. He was a king who genuinely did not seem to care what anyone thought of him, on earth or in heaven. And then, one sunny afternoon in the year 1100, he went hunting in the New Forest. Hunting was his favorite thing. In the woods that day was his brother Henry, the one with the gift card, and a bunch of nobles. At some point, a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell fired an arrow at a stag. The arrow missed the stag, glanced off a tree, and hit King William II right in the chest, killing him instantly. Was it an accident? A stray arrow in a chaotic hunt? Or was it a convenient, well-aimed assassination? Walter Tyrrell, the guy who fired the shot, immediately panicked and galloped for the coast, fleeing to France. He never came back. And Henry, the king's younger brother? He didn't waste a moment. He didn't stop to mourn his dead brother. He didn't wait for an investigation. He left William's body lying where it fell, to be found later by a local charcoal burner who carted it to Winchester in the back of his wagon. Henry, meanwhile, spurred his horse and rode like the wind, not to the crime scene, but straight to the royal treasury at Winchester. He seized the treasury, then rode to London, and within 3 days, he had himself crowned King Henry I of England. It was the smoothest, most efficient response to a tragic family accident in history. So smooth, in fact, that one might almost suspect it wasn't an accident at all. Henry I was now king, but his older brother, Robert Curthose, was on his way back from the crusade, covered in glory and expecting to claim the throne that was by rights his. So Henry I had to move fast to consolidate his power. He did two very clever things. First, he issued a Charter of Liberties, promising to be a much nicer king than his brother William Rufus had been. He promised to stop abusing the church, to stop extorting his barons, and generally to follow the rules. This was a great PR move. He had no intention of keeping all these promises, of course, but it made the barons feel like they had won something. Second, he married a woman named Edith, the daughter of the King of Scotland and, more importantly, a direct descendant of the old Anglo-Saxon kings, including Alfred the Great. He even had her change her name to the more Norman-sounding Matilda. This was a stroke of genius. It symbolically united the new Norman dynasty with the old Anglo-Saxon one. It was a message to the English people. See, we're all one big, slightly dysfunctional family now. When Robert Curthose finally landed in England to claim his prize, he found that his little brother had already locked down the entire country. After some half-hearted fighting, Robert agreed to a deal. He would give up his claim to England in exchange for a yearly pension. Henry agreed. Then, a few years later, Henry invaded Normandy, defeated Robert in battle, and locked his older brother in a castle for the rest of his life. Robert spent the last 28 years of his life as a prisoner. Henry I now had it all: England and Normandy, just like his father. He had won the family feud. Henry I ruled for 35 years, and he ruled well. He was cold, calculating, and efficient. He created the Exchequer, a government department dedicated to collecting taxes, whose officials used a giant checkered cloth like a massive abacus to do their sums. He was a master of control. But for all his brilliance, he was about to be undone by the one thing no king could control: the sea. In 1120, Henry's only legitimate son and heir, William Adelin, was crossing the English Channel from Normandy to England. He was traveling in a brand new vessel called the White Ship. The young prince and his entourage of nobles, all young, rich, and full of themselves, decided to have a party. They drank. A lot. They ordered the crew to drink with them. Then they told the drunk crew to try and overtake the king's ship, which had left earlier. In the dark, in a drunken haze, the White Ship struck a submerged rock and sank like a stone. Almost everyone on board drowned. William Adelin, the future King of England, was gone. Henry I was devastated. He had over 20 illegitimate children, but only one legitimate son. His entire plan, his whole life's work of securing the dynasty, had just sunk to the bottom of the English Channel. He had a daughter, Matilda, but the idea of a woman ruling in her own right was problematic. The Norman barons were not keen on the idea of taking orders from a queen. A queen was someone you married to get an heir, not someone who led armies and made laws. But Henry had no other choice. He made all his barons swear a solemn oath to accept his daughter Matilda as his successor. They all swore. One of the men who swore that oath was Matilda's cousin, Stephen of Blois. When Henry I died in 1135, supposedly from eating a surfeit of lampreys, a type of disgusting eel-like fish, the barons immediately forgot all about their solemn oath. Stephen of Blois, who was charming, popular, and conveniently male, raced across the channel, just like Henry I had done, seized the treasury, and had himself crowned king. He argued that a deathbed promise to a woman didn't count, especially when the stability of the kingdom was at stake. Matilda, who was in Normandy at the time and was just as tough and arrogant as any of her male relatives, was not amused. And so began the first full-blown civil war in English history since the conquest. This period is known as the Anarchy, and it lived up to its name. For nearly 20 years, England was torn apart by the war between Stephen and Matilda. Barons switched sides whenever it suited them. Castles were besieged, towns were burned, and the common people suffered terribly. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle put it best. They said openly that Christ and his saints slept. It was a miserable, grinding stalemate. Matilda would capture a key castle, then Stephen would take one of hers. At one point, Matilda had Stephen captured and was on the verge of being crowned the first Queen of England in London. But her own arrogance got the better of her. She treated the Londoners with contempt, and they chased her out of the city before she could even get the crown on her head. Stephen was freed in a prisoner exchange for Matilda's half-brother. Later, Stephen besieged Matilda in Oxford Castle. In the dead of winter, with the castle surrounded, Matilda and a few knights dressed in white sheets and slipped out, camouflaged against the snow, and escaped across the frozen River Thames. The war dragged on until everyone was just exhausted. Stephen's own son and heir died. Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, was now a grown man, and he was formidable. He was already the Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, thanks to a brilliant marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the richest and most powerful woman in Europe. In 1153, he invaded England, but by this point, nobody had the stomach for another big battle. The barons brokered a peace deal. The Treaty of Wallingford was a classic medieval compromise. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but after he died, the throne would go not to his remaining children, but to Matilda's son, Henry. Stephen, old and tired, agreed. He died less than a year later, and so the first cycle is complete. It started with an invasion and a new dynasty. It was followed by a series of brutal succession crises between brothers. It culminated in a devastating civil war, and it ended with the establishment of a new dynasty, the Plantagenets, born from the chaos. The Norman experiment was over. A new chapter was beginning, but the underlying patterns, the ambitious nobles, the problematic church, the endless wars with France, and the ever-present danger of a messy succession were all still there. The names and faces would change, but the story, in its glorious, bloody, and often ridiculous essentials, was about to repeat itself. Now we enter Cycle 2. If the Norman cycle was a brutal, straightforward action movie, the Plantagenet cycle is a sprawling, complex family saga full of passion, betrayal, and really, really bad parenting. And it all starts with our new king, Henry II. Henry Plantagenet was a force of nature. He was a stocky, red-headed man with boundless energy. He was constantly in motion, traveling his vast domains from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees Mountains in the south of France, at a speed that left his courtiers breathless and exhausted. He couldn't sit still. He would hear mass while simultaneously giving orders to messengers and doodling on parchments. He was a brilliant administrator, a legal reformer, and a man with a terrifying temper. When he got angry, he would literally roll on the floor, chew the straw, and scream like a madman. His first job as king was to clean up the mess left by the anarchy. He systematically went around England tearing down all the unauthorized castles the barons had built during the war. He re-established royal authority with a vengeance. His greatest contribution was to the law. He created the basis for what we now call English common law. He sent out traveling judges, or justices in ire, to bring the king's justice to every corner of the kingdom. He popularized the idea of trial by jury, which was a significant improvement on the old system of trial by ordeal, where you proved your innocence by, for example, grabbing a red-hot iron bar and seeing if your hand healed nicely. If it did, you were innocent. If it got infected and fell off, you were guilty. Henry's system, based on evidence and testimony from local men, was a game-changer. It made the king's justice more reliable and more accessible, which in turn made the king more powerful. But Henry had two major problems in his life. The first was the church. The second was his own family, and in a spectacular own goal, he managed to combine the two. The problem with the church was that it operated under its own legal system, canon law. If a priest committed a crime, even murder, he couldn't be tried in the king's court. He had to be tried in a church court, where the punishments were ridiculously lenient. A priest who murdered someone might be forced to say a few extra prayers or go on a pilgrimage. This was known as benefit of clergy, and it drove the control freak Henry II insane. He wanted one law for everyone, and he wanted it to be his law. So in 1162, he had a brilliant idea. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the church in England, had just died. Henry decided to appoint his best friend, his drinking buddy, his chancellor, a man named Thomas Becket, to the job. Becket was a loyal, efficient, and thoroughly worldly man who loved fine clothes, good wine, and the king's company. Henry thought, perfect. I'll make my boy Tom the Archbishop, and he'll do whatever I say. We'll sort out this whole church law problem over a few beers. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. As soon as Thomas Becket became Archbishop of Canterbury, he underwent a complete personality transplant. He resigned as chancellor. He gave away his fancy clothes and started wearing a hair shirt, a disgustingly itchy undergarment made of coarse animal hair to mortify his flesh. He stopped being the king's fun-loving bro and started being a deeply pious, incredibly stubborn defender of the church's rights. He went from being Henry's biggest supporter to his most infuriating opponent. Henry was baffled and furious. This was not part of the plan. The conflict came to a head over a document called the Constitutions of Clarendon, where Henry laid out his demands for reining in the church's power. Becket refused to accept them. The argument got so bad that Becket fled to France, where he spent 6 years in exile, sending angry letters back to Henry. Finally, a fragile truce was patched up and Becket returned to England, but he immediately started excommunicating all the bishops who had sided with the king in his absence. When news of this reached Henry, who was in Normandy, he flew into one of his famous floor-chewing rages. He screamed in the hearing of his knights, something along the lines of, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nurtured and promoted in my household? Who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born clerk? Or, more famously, though probably apocryphally, will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? 4 of his knights heard this. They looked at each other, nodded, and decided to take the king at his word. They crossed the channel, rode to Canterbury, and found Becket in his own cathedral. They confronted him, demanding that he submit to the king. He refused. They tried to drag him out, but he clung to a pillar. So they drew their swords. There, in the holy space of Canterbury Cathedral, they hacked the archbishop to death. His brains were spilled on the cathedral floor. It was a shocking, sacrilegious act. The murder of an archbishop in his own church was a PR nightmare of epic proportions. Henry was horrified, or at least, he was horrified at the political fallout. This was not what he had intended. All of Christendom was outraged. The Pope was furious. Becket was almost immediately declared a martyr and a saint. Miracles were reported at his tomb. Canterbury became the most popular pilgrimage site in England. Henry had not only failed to control the church, he had created a superstar saint for his opposition. He was forced to perform a humiliating public penance. He had to walk barefoot through the streets of Canterbury while monks flogged him with branches. He had lost. The church had won. It was a powerful lesson in the limits of royal power. But Henry's church problems were nothing compared to his family problems. He was married to the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine. Their marriage had started as a brilliant political alliance, but it had curdled into a bitter personal rivalry. And they had 4 sons who grew up to be ambitious, treacherous, and utterly ruthless. They were known as the Devil's Brood. There was Henry the young king, Richard, the future Lionheart, Geoffrey, and John, the future Disaster. Henry II made the same mistake William the Conqueror had made, but worse. He decided to crown his eldest son Henry as co-king while he was still alive. This was meant to secure the succession. Instead, it just gave the young king a title and a crown, but no actual power or money, which made him resentful and rebellious. The result was the Great Revolt of 1173. The young king, egged on by his brothers Richard and Geoffrey, and secretly supported by their mother Eleanor, rose in rebellion against their own father. They were joined by the King of France, the King of Scotland, and a bunch of disgruntled barons. It was a massive international conspiracy to overthrow one man, and it was orchestrated by his own wife and children. It's like a medieval episode of Succession. Henry II, the brilliant ruler, the man who had brought England to heel, now had to fight a war against his own family. And he won. He crushed the rebellion, captured his wife Eleanor, and put her under house arrest for the next 15 years, and then, incredibly, he forgave his sons. But they didn't learn. The rest of Henry II's reign was just a miserable, repeating cycle of his sons rebelling against him, usually with the help of the King of France. They would fight, make peace, and then one of them would rebel again. Henry the young king died of dysentery while on campaign against his father. Geoffrey died in a tournament accident in Paris, supposedly trampled to death by his own horse. That left Richard and John. In the end, even his favorite son, John, betrayed him. When Henry II was old and sick, Richard and the King of France ganged up on him one last time. Defeated and heartbroken, Henry agreed to their terms. He asked to see a list of the conspirators who had joined Richard against him. At the very top of the list was the name of his youngest, most beloved son, John. The old king turned his face to the wall. "Now let things go as they will," he whispered. "I care no more for myself or for the world." He died a few days later, a bitter, broken man, destroyed not by his enemies, but by his own children. And so the crown passed to his eldest surviving son, Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart. Now you might have heard of Richard the Lionheart. He is one of England's most famous kings, a heroic crusader, a chivalrous knight, a military genius. And most of that is true. He was a truly phenomenal soldier, but he was a terrible king of England. For one simple reason, he hated the place. He spent almost his entire 10-year reign outside of England. He spoke French, not English. He saw England as little more than a piggy bank to fund his real passion, going on crusade. His first act as king was to sell off everything he could, castles, titles, government offices, to raise money for the Third Crusade. He famously said he would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer. Then he packed his bags and left, leaving the country to be run by a committee. He spent a few years in the Holy Land fighting Saladin to a respectable draw, gaining a fearsome reputation, but ultimately failing to recapture Jerusalem. On his way home, he was shipwrecked, captured by the Duke of Austria, whom he had personally insulted on crusade, and held for a ridiculously large ransom. Back in England, his little brother John was trying to seize the throne with the help of the King of France, Philip Augustus. This is the part of the story where Robin Hood is supposed to show up, but he didn't. The real work of governing England and raising the king's ransom fell to his long-suffering mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and his government officials. They had to impose a massive kingdom-wide tax, a 25% tax on income and movable property, to bail out their absentee king. Eventually, the ransom was paid, Richard was released, and he came back to England just long enough to get crowned again, to wash away the shame of his captivity, and to forgive his treacherous little brother John. Then he immediately left for France to fight King Philip, and he never set foot in England again. He spent the last 5 years of his life fighting to win back the French territories he had lost while he was away. He died in 1199, not in a glorious battle, but from a crossbow bolt fired by a boy from the walls of a minor, insignificant castle he was besieging. The wound turned gangrenous. The Lionheart, the great warrior king, was killed by a random nobody, and so the throne passed to the last surviving son of Henry II, the one who had betrayed his father and his brother, the one nobody wanted. Prince John, now King John. John is almost universally remembered as the worst king in English history, a villain, the bad guy in the Robin Hood stories. And while he wasn't quite the cackling, thumb-sucking lion from the Disney movie, he wasn't far off. He was cruel, petty, greedy, and deeply untrustworthy. He had all of his father's bad qualities, the temper, the ruthlessness, but none of his good ones. He was, in short, a disaster. His reign was a masterclass in how to lose friends and alienate people. First, he lost Normandy, the ancestral home of the English kings, the duchy his great-grandfather had conquered England to keep. John lost it to the French king Philip Augustus in a few years of inept campaigning. This was a humiliation. It also meant that the English barons, who had just lost all their profitable French lands, were now stuck in England with a king they despised. Second, he got into a massive fight with the Pope. Just like his father, he wanted to choose his own Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope, Innocent III, wanted to choose his. They argued. John refused to back down, so the Pope placed all of England under an interdict. For 6 years, all church services were suspended. No masses, no baptisms, no Christian burials. The dead were buried in unconsecrated ground like animals. It was a spiritual lockdown. Then the Pope excommunicated John personally. Finally, he threatened to authorize the King of France to invade and depose him. Faced with a French invasion and a deeply unhappy populace, John caved completely. He not only accepted the Pope's choice for Archbishop, he went one step further. He surrendered his entire kingdom to the Pope and received it back as a papal fief. He basically made the Pope his landlord. He had gone from defying the Pope to becoming his vassal. Third, and most fatally, he squeezed his barons for every penny they had. To pay for his failed wars in France, he imposed scutage, a fee paid to avoid military service, at an unprecedented rate. He charged exorbitant fees for inheritances and marriages. He seized hostages from baronial families and was widely suspected of murdering his own nephew, Arthur of Brittany, a rival claimant to the throne. He was a tyrant, and his barons had had enough. In 1215, a coalition of powerful barons rebelled. They cornered John and forced him to meet them in a meadow by the River Thames called Runnymede. There, they presented him with a list of demands, a charter of liberties that would become one of the most famous documents in the history of the world, Magna Carta. Now let's pause for a quick myth-busting session. You may have heard that Magna Carta was a revolutionary document that established democracy, trial by jury, and freedom for the common man. It was not. Magna Carta was not about the rights of the common man at all. The common man is barely mentioned. It was a deeply conservative document written by a bunch of rich guys to protect their own interests from a king they didn't like. Most of its 63 clauses are about specific feudal grievances, inheritance fees, the rights of widows, the management of wards. The famous clauses that are often quoted, like "no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land," were intended to protect the barons from the king's arbitrary justice. Free man, in 1215, meant a very small slice of the population. It did not mean the vast majority of people who were unfree peasants. But, and this is a big but, it did establish a crucial principle: the king is not above the law. It asserted that even the king had to follow the rules, and it included a truly radical security clause, Clause 61, which set up a committee of 25 barons to monitor the king and, if he broke the charter, to wage war against him. This was revolutionary. It was a formal, legal justification for rebellion. John, under duress, put his seal on the document, but he had absolutely no intention of following it. He wrote to his new best friend, the Pope, complaining that he had been forced to sign it. The Pope, now John's landlord, immediately declared Magna Carta null and void, and so England plunged into yet another civil war, the First Barons' War. The rebel barons did something drastic. They invited the Prince of France to invade and become their king. It looked like the whole Norman conquest was about to happen again, but in reverse. The country was in chaos. And then, in the middle of it all, King John did something very on brand. While campaigning in the east of England, he tried to take a shortcut across a tidal estuary called the Wash. He made it across safely, but his baggage train, which was following behind, was not so lucky. The tide came in faster than expected, and the entire train, containing all his royal treasure, including the crown jewels, was swept away and lost forever. A few days later, John, already sick with dysentery, was overwhelmed with grief and rage at his loss. He fell into a fever and died in Newark Castle. His disastrous reign was over, and with his death, the whole political situation changed. John's son and heir, Henry, was only 9 years old. The rebel barons suddenly had a choice. They could stick with the adult French prince, or they could switch their allegiance to a 9-year-old English king who they could control. They chose the kid. The French prince was sent packing. The Loyalist government, led by the legendary knight William Marshal, immediately reissued Magna Carta, but without the awkward "let's rebel against the king" clause. By reissuing it, they turned it from a rebel manifesto into a statement of legitimate government. And just like that, the cycle repeated. A disastrous king who pushed his luck too far was followed by a period of chaos, which was resolved by the reassertion of a new, weaker form of kingship, bound by law. The Plantagenet machine had chewed up another monarch and spat him out. Henry III, the boy king, would go on to have the longest reign of any medieval English monarch, 56 years. And for most of it, he was just fine. He wasn't a tyrant like his father. He was pious, cultured, and a great patron of the arts. He rebuilt Westminster Abbey into the Gothic masterpiece it is today. But he was also politically inept and had a habit of giving all the best jobs and lands to his French relatives and his wife's French relatives, which infuriated the English barons. Does a king who favors foreign cronies and annoys his nobles sound familiar? It should. We're back in the loop. The barons' discontent was led by a man named Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester. De Montfort was actually one of the Frenchmen Henry had favored. He was Henry's brother-in-law, but he had a falling out with the king and became the unlikely leader of the opposition. In 1258, the barons marched on Parliament, a term that was now being used for these great councils of the kingdom, and forced Henry to agree to a new set of reforms, the Provisions of Oxford. This was Magna Carta on steroids. It set up a council of 15 barons to advise the king and basically run the country. For a while, England was effectively a constitutional monarchy. Henry predictably hated this. He got the Pope to absolve him of his oath, a classic Plantagenet move, and tried to regain power. This led to yet another civil war, the Second Barons' War. At the Battle of Lewes in 1264, Simon de Montfort's army defeated the king's forces and captured both King Henry and his formidable son, Prince Edward. For the next year, Simon de Montfort was the de facto ruler of England, and in an effort to broaden his support, he did something remarkable. He summoned a parliament, but he invited not only the usual barons and clergy, but also 2 knights from every shire and 2 burgesses from every major town. It was the first time that ordinary townsfolk and minor gentry had been invited to participate in national politics. It was not a democratic parliament in the modern sense, but it was a radical step. De Montfort's rule didn't last. Prince Edward escaped from captivity, raised an army, and confronted de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. De Montfort's army was hopelessly outnumbered. Before the battle, seeing Edward's banners approaching, he reportedly said, "May God have mercy on our souls, for our bodies are theirs." He was right. The royalist army annihilated his forces. De Montfort himself was killed, and his body was brutally mutilated. They cut off his head, his hands, his feet, and his genitals and sent them to different parts of the country as a warning. It was a savage end to a brief experiment in limited government. King Henry III was restored to the throne, but he was a broken man. The real power for the rest of his reign was his son, Edward. When Henry died in 1272, Edward was away on crusade. But this time, there was no crisis. No one challenged his right to the throne. The message was sent to him, and the government simply continued to run in his name until he got back 2 years later. The principle of primogeniture, that the eldest son automatically inherits, was finally becoming solid. The succession cycle, at least for now, seemed to be stabilizing. Edward I was a different breed from his father. He was tall. At 6'2", he was nicknamed Longshanks. He was a fearsome warrior, and he was a ruthless and efficient ruler. He had learned the hard lessons from his father's reign. You had to control the barons, and you had to have a purpose that united the kingdom. His purpose was conquest. He was determined to bring the entire island of Britain under his rule. First, he turned his attention to Wales. The Welsh princes had always been a thorn in the side of English kings. Edward launched a series of massive, well-organized campaigns. He didn't just defeat the Welsh in battle, he subjugated them completely. He built a chain of gigantic, state-of-the-art stone castles, Conchi, Caernarfon, Harlech, that dwarfed the old Norman keeps. These were not just forts, they were symbols of permanent domination, English power stamped onto the Welsh landscape. He executed the last native prince of Wales, Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, and had his head paraded through London. To seal his victory, he named his own infant son Edward the Prince of Wales, a title the heir to the English throne has held ever since. Next, he turned his attention to Scotland. The Scottish throne had fallen vacant, and there were multiple claimants. The Scottish nobles, in a move they would come to regret, invited Edward I to arbitrate. This was like asking a wolf to mediate a dispute between sheep. Edward agreed, but only if the Scots first recognized him as their feudal overlord. They reluctantly agreed. He chose a man named John Balliol to be king, assuming he would be a compliant puppet. But the Scots were not so easily tamed. When Edward demanded they fight for him in his wars against France, the Scots refused and made an alliance with the French instead. This was the beginning of the Auld Alliance, a Franco-Scottish pact against their common English enemy that would last for centuries. Edward was furious. In 1296, he invaded Scotland with a massive army, sacked the town of Berwick-upon-Tweed with appalling brutality, and crushed the Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar. He deposed John Balliol, declared himself the direct ruler of Scotland, and stole the Stone of Scone, the sacred stone upon which Scottish kings were crowned, and took it back to Westminster Abbey to be fitted into a new coronation chair for English kings. It was a calculated act of national humiliation. He thought he had conquered Scotland. He was wrong. The Scots rose up in rebellion, this time led by a commoner, a knight named William Wallace. Yes, that William Wallace. He won a stunning victory against a larger English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. For a brief time, he was the guardian of Scotland. But Edward I was not a man to be trifled with. He returned with another huge army, and using his secret weapon, the English longbow, he annihilated Wallace's army at the Battle of Falkirk. Wallace escaped, but was eventually betrayed, captured, and taken to London. His execution was designed to be a terrifying spectacle. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. His head was stuck on a pike on London Bridge, and his limbs were sent to the four corners of Scotland as a warning. But the warning didn't work. The Scottish resistance simply found a new leader, Robert the Bruce, a Scottish noble who had previously sided with Edward. Bruce had himself crowned King of Scots and renewed the war. Edward I, now old and frail but still burning with rage, raised one last army and marched north to crush Bruce once and for all. But he never made it. He died just south of the Scottish border in 1307. His dying wish was that his bones be carried at the head of the English army until Scotland was conquered. His son did not grant this wish. Edward I's reign represents the Plantagenet cycle at its most effective and its most brutal. He was a strong king who dominated his barons, expanded his kingdom, and gave his people a sense of national purpose, largely through hating the Welsh and the Scots. He also regularized the practice of summoning Parliament, not because he believed in representation, but because it was the most efficient way to raise taxes for his endless wars. What touches all, he argued, should be approved by all. It was a convenient justification for picking everyone's pockets at once. He had taken the chaotic energies of the Plantagenet dynasty and focused them outwards, but he left his son a bankrupt treasury and an unwinnable war in Scotland. The pendulum was about to swing back, and so we begin the acceleration phase. The cycles start coming faster. The highs are higher, the lows are lower, and the kings drop like flies. Edward II was the polar opposite of his father. Where Edward I was tall, imposing, and hypermasculine, Edward II was not. He was more interested in things like thatching roofs and digging ditches with common laborers than in jousting and warfare, and he had a fatal tendency to lavish power, titles, and affection on a series of male favorites. The first and most famous was a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston. The barons, who were already annoyed by Edward's lack of interest in being a proper king, were driven into a rage by the power he gave to this upstart. They saw Gaveston as a threat to their own influence, and more importantly, an insult to their dignity. They forced Edward to exile Gaveston multiple times, but the king always brought him back. Meanwhile, Robert the Bruce was running rings around the English in Scotland. In 1314, Edward II finally got his act together and led a massive army north to deal with the Scottish problem. The two armies met at Bannockburn. The English army was huge, but it was badly led and overconfident. The Scottish army, led by Bruce, was smaller but disciplined and fighting on home turf. The result was the single greatest disaster in English military history. The English knights got bogged down in marshy ground, the archers couldn't get a clear shot, and the Scottish spearmen, arranged in tight formations called schiltrons, systematically destroyed the English cavalry. Edward II himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing the battlefield in disgrace. Bannockburn secured Scottish independence for the next 400 years. Edward's humiliation was complete. His authority was shattered. The barons, led by his cousin Thomas of Lancaster, took control of the government. They captured Piers Gaveston and after a sham trial had him executed. Edward was heartbroken and swore revenge. For a few years, he managed to regain some power and even defeated and executed Thomas of Lancaster. But then he just found a new set of favorites, a father and son duo called the Despensers, who were even more greedy and arrogant than Gaveston had been. This was the last straw. The opposition now found an unlikely leader, Edward's own wife, Queen Isabella. Isabella of France was the daughter of the French king, a formidable woman who had been publicly humiliated by her husband's devotion to his favorites. She went to France on a diplomatic mission and refused to come back. There, she took a lover, a powerful, exiled English baron named Roger Mortimer. Together, Isabella and Mortimer became the ultimate power couple of medieval opposition. They raised a small army, and in 1326, they invaded England. They landed with almost no opposition. The country, sick of Edward and the Despensers, flocked to their banner. The Despensers were captured and brutally executed. King Edward II was captured and forced to abdicate his throne in favor of his young son, Edward III. But what to do with a deposed king? Keeping him alive was a risk. In January 1327, Edward II was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. A few months later, it was announced that he had died. The official story was that he died of natural causes. The unofficial, and much more lurid story is that he was murdered in a particularly gruesome way, by having a red-hot poker inserted into his anus. This method, so the story goes, was chosen so that it would leave no outward marks on his body. Historians are divided on whether this actually happened, but it's a story that perfectly captures the savage politics of the age. A weak king who failed to live up to the brutal standards of his time met a brutal end, overthrown by his own wife and her lover. The cycle of deposition and murder was back with a vengeance. For a few years, Isabella and Mortimer ruled England in the name of the young Edward III, but they were just as greedy and unpopular as the Despensers had been. In 1330, the young king, now 18, decided he had had enough of being his mother's puppet. In a daring nighttime raid, he and a group of loyal companions snuck into Nottingham Castle through a secret tunnel, burst into his mother's chambers, and arrested Roger Mortimer. Mortimer was swiftly tried and executed as a traitor. Queen Isabella was forced into a comfortable but powerless retirement. Edward III at last was king in his own right. Edward III was everything his father was not. He was handsome, chivalrous, a brilliant soldier, and he understood the importance of good PR. He was determined to restore the prestige of the English monarchy after the disaster of his father's reign. He learned from his grandfather, Edward I. A king needs a good war to keep the barons busy and the taxes flowing, and he had the perfect war ready-made, a war with France. His claim was audacious. The French king had died without a son. Through his mother, Isabella, Edward III had a plausible, if legally shaky, claim to the French throne itself. In 1337, he formally declared himself King of France, and so began the conflict that would dominate the next century, the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was not one continuous war, but a series of conflicts punctuated by truces. And in its early stages, England was stunningly successful. At the Battle of Crecy in 1346 and again at Poitiers in 1356, small English armies, composed mostly of yeoman archers armed with the devastating longbow, annihilated massive French armies of aristocratic knights. The longbow could shoot faster, farther, and with more penetrating power than the French crossbows. It was the medieval equivalent of a machine gun. The flower of French chivalry was mown down by English commoners. At Poitiers, the English even captured the French king, John II, and held him for ransom. It was a national humiliation for France and a source of immense pride and profit for England. Edward III had created a new cult of chivalry around himself, founding the Order of the Garter, an exclusive club for his top knights. War with France became a profitable national enterprise. But this golden age was interrupted by a catastrophe far worse than any war. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in England. The bubonic plague swept across the country, killing somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population. It was an unimaginable disaster. Fields went untilled, villages were abandoned, and the social order was turned upside down. With so many people dead, labor was suddenly in short supply. The surviving peasants found that they could demand higher wages and better conditions. The old feudal system of serfdom began to crumble. The government tried to stop this by passing laws to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but it was impossible to enforce. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it profoundly changed the economic and social landscape of England forever. Edward III's long reign eventually fizzled out. His later years were marked by military defeats in France, senility, and a grasping mistress named Alice Perrers who wielded far too much influence. His formidable eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, so called probably because of the color of his armor, was a brilliant soldier, but died of dysentery before his father, leaving his own young son, Richard, as the heir. When Edward III finally died in 1377, the throne passed to his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II. Another boy king. Another round of instability. Richard II's reign started with a major crisis, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. A combination of simmering post-plague discontent and a new, deeply unpopular poll tax sparked a massive uprising in the southeast of England. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and a radical priest named John Ball, who famously preached, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" The rebels marched on London, burning manor houses and killing government officials. The young king, Richard, only 14 years old, rode out to meet them. In a moment of incredible bravery, or foolhardiness, he confronted the rebel army. During a tense negotiation, the Lord Mayor of London killed Wat Tyler. The rebel army was about to erupt into violence, but Richard spurred his horse forward and shouted, "Sirs, will you shoot your king? I am your captain. Follow me." He led them out of the city, promising to grant all their demands. As soon as they dispersed, he went back on every single promise and had the ringleaders rounded up and executed. It was a moment of decisive, ruthless action. But Richard's personality was complex. He wasn't a warrior like his father and grandfather. He had a deep appreciation for art, culture, and the finer things in life. He also had an exalted, almost mystical sense of his own royal authority. He believed he was chosen by God and that his will was absolute. As he grew older, he became increasingly tyrannical and out of touch with his powerful nobles. He surrounded himself with a small circle of unpopular favorites and ruled without regard for parliament or the traditions of the realm. Sound familiar? It's the Edward II story all over again, but this time with better taste in clothes. His main opponent was a group of powerful nobles known as the Lords Appellant, which included his own uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, and his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of the powerful John of Gaunt. They effectively seized power for a time, executing some of Richard's favorites. Richard bided his time. Then, in 1397, he struck back. He had the Duke of Gloucester murdered. He exiled Henry Bolingbroke and another of the appellants. When Henry's father, John of Gaunt, died, Richard did something that violated the most fundamental principle of aristocratic society. He confiscated the entire vast Lancastrian inheritance that should have gone to the exiled Henry. This was a fatal mistake. By disinheriting his own cousin, he showed every nobleman in the kingdom that their own property and titles were not safe. In 1399, while Richard was away on a campaign in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke landed in England. He claimed he was only coming back to claim his rightful inheritance as Duke of Lancaster, but the country, sick of Richard's tyranny, flocked to him. By the time Richard got back from Ireland, he had lost his kingdom. He was captured, forced to abdicate, and imprisoned in Pontefract Castle. A few months later, it was announced that he had died, probably starved to death. Henry Bolingbroke was crowned King Henry IV. A king had been deposed and replaced by his cousin. The precedent set in Edward II's time had been repeated. The door was now wide open for any powerful nobleman with a half-decent claim and a big enough army to make a play for the throne. The Wars of the Roses were just around the corner. The reign of Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster, was plagued by the fact that he was a usurper. He spent his entire reign fighting rebellions from people who thought they had a better claim to the throne, or who were simply annoyed he hadn't rewarded them enough for helping him get it. He was constantly sick, suffering from a debilitating skin disease that some saw as God's punishment for his usurpation. He died in 1413, a weary and disappointed man, passing a troubled crown to his son. His son, Henry V, was a superstar. He was the ultimate warrior king immortalized by Shakespeare. He was determined to put the legitimacy question to rest by winning a glorious foreign war. He renewed the 100 Years' War with France, which had been dormant for a generation. In 1415, he invaded France with a small army and found himself trapped and outnumbered by a massive French force near a village called Agincourt. What happened next was a near repeat of crises. The English army, composed mainly of longbowmen, was positioned on muddy ground. The French, a glittering host of heavily armored knights, charged. They got bogged down in the mud, and the English archers slaughtered them. It was another miraculous victory against impossible odds. Henry V went on to conquer a huge chunk of northern France. He was so successful that in 1420, he forced the mad French king Charles VI to sign the Treaty of Troyes. This treaty was astonishing. It disinherited the French king's own son, the Dauphin Charles, and made Henry V the heir to the French throne. Henry married the French king's daughter, Catherine of Valois, to seal the deal. It looked like the dream of Edward III, to unite the crowns of England and France, was about to become a reality. Henry V was at the absolute peak of his power, and then 2 years later, at the age of 35, he contracted dysentery while on campaign and died. His son, Henry VI, was 9 months old. The glorious warrior king was replaced by an infant, and England was now saddled with the impossible task of trying to rule France on behalf of a baby. It was a recipe for disaster. The French, unsurprisingly, were not keen on being ruled by the English. The disinherited Dauphin found an inspirational new leader in a teenage peasant girl who claimed to hear voices from God, Joan of Arc. Joan led a revival of French fortunes, lifting the siege of Orléans and escorting the Dauphin to be crowned as King Charles VII. Although Joan was eventually captured by the English and their allies and burned at the stake as a heretic, she had lit a fire under the French that could not be extinguished. Over the next 2 decades, the English were slowly but surely pushed out of France. By 1453, the 100 Years' War was over. Of all their vast French possessions, only the port of Calais remained. All the glory and sacrifice of Agincourt had come to nothing. Back in England, things were even worse. Henry VI grew up to be a gentle, pious, and utterly ineffectual ruler. He was more suited to being a monk than a king. He was prone to bouts of mental illness, including a year-long catatonic stupor where he was completely unresponsive. The government was run by a clique of unpopular nobles surrounding his powerful and ambitious French wife, Margaret of Anjou. The loss of France was a national humiliation, and the king was blamed. The country was simmering with discontent. And now, the other side of the family decided it was their turn. The House of York, descended from a different son of Edward III, had a claim to the throne that was arguably better than the Lancastrian one. The leader of the Yorkist faction was Richard, Duke of York. He was everything Henry VI was not. Competent, popular, and a capable soldier. As the king's government floundered, more and more people began to look to York as an alternative. Sound familiar? A weak, ineffectual king, an unpopular queen, a disastrous foreign policy, and a powerful nobleman waiting in the wings. It was the same dynamic that had brought down Edward II and Richard II. But this time, both sides had powerful private armies and a whole lot of angry, unemployed soldiers just back from the war in France. This is the Wars of the Roses. Not a single war, but a 30-year period of brutal, on-again, off-again civil war between 2 branches of the same family. The House of Lancaster, symbolized by a red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by a white rose. The whole thing was a dynastic blood feud on a national scale. The crown of England became a deadly prize in a game of musical thrones. The first battle was at St. Albans in 1455. York won and took control of the government, becoming protector of the realm during one of the king's mental breakdowns. Then the king recovered, and Queen Margaret's faction took back power. Then they fought again, and again. The crown swapped heads with bewildering speed. In 1460, Richard of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, his head stuck on the gates of York wearing a paper crown. But his son, Edward, took up the cause. Edward was young, handsome, charismatic, and a brilliant military commander. In 1461, he crushed the Lancastrian army at the Battle of Towton, a horrific, bloody battle fought in a snowstorm that may have been the largest and deadliest battle ever fought on English soil. Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou fled. The young Edward of York was crowned King Edward IV, but the cycle wasn't over. Edward IV then had a falling out with his most powerful supporter, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. Warwick was furious that Edward had secretly married a commoner, Elizabeth Woodville, instead of the French princess Warwick had been trying to arrange a match with. So Warwick, the Kingmaker, switched sides. He made an alliance with his old enemy, Margaret of Anjou, invaded England, and put Henry VI back on the throne. Edward IV was forced to flee into exile. For a few months, the sad, bewildered Henry VI was king again, but Edward IV was not done. He came back with an army, defeated and killed Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, and then crushed the rest of the Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Tewkesbury, where Henry VI's only son was killed. The Lancastrian line was all but extinguished. Edward IV returned to London and retook the throne. A few days later, Henry VI died in the Tower of London, almost certainly murdered on Edward's orders. For the next 12 years, Edward IV ruled in relative peace. He was a capable, if ruthless, king. It seemed like the wars were finally over. And then, in 1483, Edward IV, still in his prime at age 40, suddenly fell ill and died. He left behind two young sons, the 12-year-old heir, Edward V, and his younger brother, Richard. And he left behind a younger brother of his own, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. This is the Richard, the hunchbacked Machiavellian villain of Shakespeare's play. The historical Richard was not a hunchback, though he did have a minor spinal curvature. But he was ambitious. He was appointed Lord Protector for his young nephew, Edward V. But he didn't want to be the protector. He wanted to be the king. In a stunningly rapid and ruthless coup, Richard of Gloucester moved to seize power. He had the young king's maternal relatives, the Woodvilles, arrested and executed. He took custody of Edward V and his little brother and lodged them in the Tower of London, supposedly for their own safety. Then he had a friendly preacher give a sermon declaring that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, and therefore their children were illegitimate. Parliament, under considerable duress, declared Richard the rightful king. He was crowned King Richard III. But what happened to the two little boys in the tower? The princes in the tower? They were seen playing in the Tower Gardens for a few weeks, and then they vanished. They were never seen again. The almost universal assumption, then and now, is that Richard III had his own nephews murdered to secure his throne. It was the final, horrifying act in a generation of dynastic bloodshed. It was also a massive political mistake. The murder of two innocent children horrified the country and turned many of Richard's own supporters against him. The opposition now coalesced around an unlikely figure, Henry Tudor. Henry's claim to the throne was incredibly weak. He was descended from a legitimized bastard line of the Lancastrians, but he was the last man standing with any connection to the Lancastrian cause. Living in exile in France, he became the focus of all the discontented Yorkists and die-hard Lancastrians who hated Richard III. In 1485, with French backing, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small, ragtag army. He marched into England, gathering support as he went. Richard III met him at Bosworth Field. The Battle of Bosworth Field was the final, decisive battle of the Wars of the Roses. Richard's army was larger, but key parts of it, led by nobles who were secretly in league with Henry, refused to fight. At a critical moment, Richard saw Henry Tudor's small bodyguard separated from the main army. In a last, desperate gamble, Richard personally led a cavalry charge straight at his rival, trying to end the battle by killing Henry himself. He got terrifyingly close, cutting down Henry's standard-bearer. But at that moment, Lord Stanley, one of the nobles who had been waiting to see which way the wind blew, finally committed his forces. He attacked Richard's flank. Richard was surrounded, pulled from his horse, and hacked to death. His crown, which he had worn into battle, was supposedly found under a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head. The Wars of the Roses were over. A new dynasty had begun. The Plantagenet era, in all its glorious, violent, and chaotic splendor, was finished. And so the cycle starts again, but with a new twist. The Tudor dynasty was born from the wreckage of the old one, and its first king, Henry VII, was a man who understood one thing above all. After 30 years of civil war, what England wanted most was peace, stability, and a government that actually balanced its books. Henry VII is often called the Winter King. He was not a glamorous warrior like Henry V or a charismatic leader like Edward IV. He was a shrewd, suspicious, and deeply boring accountant. And he was exactly what the country needed. His first act was a brilliant piece of political branding. He, the Lancastrian claimant, married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of the Yorkist king Edward IV. This united the two warring houses. He then created a new emblem, the Tudor Rose, which combined the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. It was a visual promise of unity and an end to the feud. But he still had to deal with rebellions. The Yorkist cause wasn't quite dead. For the next few years, Henry had to deal with a series of pretenders, impostors who claimed to be one of the lost princes in the Tower or another Yorkist heir. The first was a boy named Lambert Simnel, who claimed to be the Earl of Warwick, a Yorkist cousin who was actually locked in the Tower. The rebellion was crushed, and Henry, in a move of brilliant psychological warfare, pardoned the boy and gave him a job in the royal kitchens. A few years later, another more serious pretender emerged, a young Fleming named Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be the younger of the two princes, Richard of York. He gained support from foreign powers and was a thorn in Henry's side for years before he was finally captured and executed. But Henry VII's real genius was for money. He was obsessed with fiscal stability. He avoided expensive foreign wars. He imposed heavy fines on overmighty nobles. He used a special court, the Court of Star Chamber, to bring his enemies to heel. He used ruthless tax collectors like Empson and Dudley to squeeze every last penny out of the kingdom. He was deeply unpopular for it, but when he died in 1509, he passed on a peaceful, stable kingdom and a full treasury to his son. He had successfully broken the cycle of civil war and bankruptcy that had plagued England for a century. He had done the boring, necessary work of rebuilding the monarchy. And now, the stage was set for his son, a young man who had no interest in being boring at all. His son was Henry VIII. And with Henry VIII, we get a whole new kind of cycle, a sub-cycle within the larger story, the obsessive, destructive quest for a male heir. Henry VIII came to the throne as a golden prince. He was 18, handsome, athletic, intelligent, a true Renaissance man. He loved hunting, jousting, music, and theology. He was everything the English wanted in a king. He immediately married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess who had been in diplomatic limbo for years. And for the first half of his reign, things were pretty good. He let his brilliant chancellor, Cardinal Wolsey, run the country while he went off to have some largely pointless but very glamorous wars with France. Catherine gave him a daughter, Mary, but she failed to produce a son. One after another, her pregnancies ended in miscarriages or stillbirths. As Henry got older, the lack of a male heir became an obsession. He saw it as a sign of God's displeasure. He started looking at the Bible and found a passage in Leviticus that said, "A man who marries his brother's wife will be childless." He became convinced that his marriage to Catherine was cursed. He also happened to have fallen passionately in love with a charismatic, intelligent, and ambitious young woman at court, Anne Boleyn. Anne was not interested in being the king's mistress. She wanted to be queen, and she promised him a son. So Henry decided he needed a divorce, or rather, an annulment. He needed the Pope to declare that his marriage to Catherine had been invalid from the start. He gave the task to Cardinal Wolsey, telling him to get it done. But Wolsey had a problem. The Pope, Clement VII, was effectively the prisoner of a very powerful man, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. And Charles V was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. There was no way the Pope was going to annul Charles's aunt's marriage just to please the King of England. For years, Wolsey tried every diplomatic trick in the book, but he failed. And for his failure, Henry stripped him of his power and his wealth. Wolsey died on his way to London to face treason charges. Henry was now desperate, and it was at this point that a new set of radical advisors, men like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, came to him with a truly revolutionary idea. They basically told him, "Your Majesty, you don't need the Pope's permission. You are the king. In your own kingdom, you are the supreme authority. Why not just declare yourself the head of the church in England? Then you can grant your own annulment." It was a breathtakingly bold solution, and Henry, a man whose ego was as large as his kingdom, loved it. And so, in a series of acts of parliament pushed through by the ruthlessly efficient Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII broke with Rome. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. He had Thomas Cranmer, his new Archbishop of Canterbury, annul his marriage to Catherine. He married the now pregnant Anne Boleyn. The English Reformation was not born out of a deep theological dispute like Luther's in Germany. It was born out of a king's desperate need for a divorce and a male heir. It was an act of state, not an act of faith. Henry then proceeded to dissolve the monasteries. Cromwell, the ultimate project manager, sent his agents around the country to catalog the immense wealth of England's monasteries and abbeys. Then, one by one, they were closed down, their lands and treasures seized by the crown. It was the greatest single transfer of wealth in English history since the Norman conquest. It made the king incredibly rich, and it allowed him to buy the loyalty of the nobility and gentry by selling them cheap monastic land. It also destroyed a centuries-old tradition of monastic life, learning, and charity. It was a revolution from the top down. But did Henry get what he wanted? Not exactly. Anne Boleyn gave birth not to the promised son, but to another daughter, Elizabeth. Henry was bitterly disappointed. His passion for Anne quickly soured. When she too failed to produce a male heir, he needed a way out. But he couldn't get another annulment without looking like a complete fool. So, his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, found another solution. He manufactured a case against Anne. She was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, and of witchcraft and treason. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, but she was found guilty. In 1536, Anne Boleyn, the woman who had changed the course of English history, was beheaded on Tower Green. 11 days later, Henry married wife number 3, Jane Seymour, and Jane finally gave Henry what he had always wanted. She gave birth to a son, Edward. Henry was ecstatic, but his joy was short-lived. Jane Seymour died from complications of childbirth just a few days later. She was the only one of Henry's wives that he truly seemed to love, and he commanded that he be buried next to her. The quest for an heir was complete, but the matrimonial merry-go-round was not. Thomas Cromwell, trying to secure a Protestant alliance in Europe, arranged a marriage for Henry with a German princess, Anne of Cleves. He commissioned a beautiful portrait of her from the court painter Hans Holbein. Henry liked the portrait and agreed to the match, but when Anne of Cleves arrived in England, the reality did not live up to the painting. Henry took one look at her and was repulsed. He famously called her the Flanders mare. He went through with the marriage but couldn't bring himself to consummate it. The whole thing was a diplomatic and personal disaster. He quickly divorced her, and he never forgave Cromwell for it. A few months later, the brilliant, ruthless Thomas Cromwell, the man who had engineered the Reformation, followed his old enemy Anne Boleyn to the executioner's block. Wife number 5 was Catherine Howard, a young, vivacious, and deeply unwise niece of the powerful Duke of Norfolk. She was a teenager. Henry was nearly 50, grossly overweight, and suffering from a festering, foul-smelling ulcer on his leg. The marriage was doomed from the start. Catherine was foolish enough to carry on an affair with a gentleman of the court. When her past indiscretions and her current affair were revealed to the king, he was heartbroken and then incandescent with rage. Catherine Howard and her lovers were executed. His 6th and final wife was Catherine Parr, a mature, twice-widowed woman who was more of a nurse and companion to the aging, ailing king than a romantic partner. She was a devout Protestant and skillfully navigated the treacherous currents of the court, even surviving a plot by her enemies to have her arrested for heresy. She outlived Henry. Henry VIII died in 1547, a bloated, paranoid, and tyrannical wreck of the golden prince he had once been. He left behind a kingdom that was religiously divided, a treasury that was once again empty despite the plunder of the monasteries, and a deeply uncertain succession. He had his precious male heir, but he also had 2 daughters from 2 different annulled marriages, Mary and Elizabeth, who had both been declared illegitimate and then later restored to the line of succession. He had broken the church, rewritten the laws of God and man, and executed 2 wives and some of his closest advisors, all in pursuit of dynastic security. And what he had created was one of the most dangerously unstable religious and political situations imaginable. The Tudor cycle was about to enter its most volatile phase, and as Henry VIII was trying to manage his chaotic personal life and his even more chaotic kingdom, he probably could have used a way to simplify things. A way to get what he needed, when he needed it, without all the fuss of beheading people. He would have loved a service that delivers everything right to your door. Which brings me to our sponsor for today's video. Now, I know what you're thinking. A sponsor? In the middle of the 16th century? But let's be honest, if a service existed back then that could deliver fine wines, exotic foods, and maybe even a discreet headsman's axe with free 2-day shipping, Henry would have been their #1 customer. He'd be scrolling through potential wife portraits on his phone, if phones existed, while yelling at Cromwell to apply a promo code. Today's sponsor can't deliver you a new spouse, but they can deliver almost everything else, making your life a whole lot simpler than Henry's. Use code HISTORY at checkout for 10% off your first order. It's a much better deal than Henry got from Thomas Cromwell. And unlike Cromwell, our sponsor is unlikely to lose their head over a failed diplomatic marriage. Now, back to the mess Henry left behind. The throne passed to Henry's 9-year-old son, Edward VI. Because Edward was a minor, the country was run by a council of regents, dominated by his ardently Protestant uncle, the Duke of Somerset. And this is where the English Reformation went into overdrive. Under Henry VIII, the Church of England had been Catholic, but without the Pope. It still had priests, masses in Latin, and elaborate rituals. Under Edward VI, England became genuinely Protestant. Somerset and the influential Archbishop Thomas Cranmer set about dismantling the old religion. They introduced a new prayer book, the Book of Common Prayer, written in English. They stripped the churches of their statues, their stained glass, and their gold plate, whitewashing over the colorful medieval wall paintings. Priests were allowed to marry. The Mass was abolished and replaced with a simple communion service. For many ordinary people, this was a shocking and unwelcome revolution. It was as if their entire spiritual world was being torn down and replaced with something cold, plain, and unfamiliar. There were rebellions, which were brutally suppressed. But the young King Edward was a frail and sickly boy. By 1553, it was clear he was dying of tuberculosis, and this created a massive problem. According to Henry VIII's will, the next in line was his eldest daughter, Mary, and Mary was as passionately and stubbornly Catholic as her mother, Catherine of Aragon, had been. The Protestant establishment around Edward, led now by the Duke of Northumberland, knew that if Mary became queen, they were all finished. Their religious revolution would be undone, and they would probably lose their heads. So in a desperate attempt to cling to power, Northumberland cooked up a scheme. He persuaded the dying Edward to write Mary and her half-sister Elizabeth out of the succession and to name his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as his heir. To seal the deal, Northumberland married his own son to Jane. When Edward VI died, the 16-year-old Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. She was a scholarly, intelligent young woman who had no desire to be queen and fainted when they told her the news. She reigned for all of 9 days. The country did not rally to her. They saw her as a puppet of the hated Northumberland. Instead, they rallied to the person they saw as the legitimate heir, Mary Tudor. Mary raised an army, marched on London, and the whole plot collapsed without a fight. Northumberland was executed, and the unfortunate 9-day queen, Lady Jane Grey, and her young husband were imprisoned in the Tower. Mary was now Queen Mary I, the first undisputed queen regnant in English history, and she had a mission: to return England to the one true faith, to bring the country back to Rome. Mary's reign is remembered for one thing: fire. She is Bloody Mary. And it's not an entirely unfair nickname. She began by reversing all of Edward VI's Protestant reforms and restoring the authority of the Pope. But she and her advisors believed that heresy was a disease that had to be burned out. Over the next 5 years, nearly 300 Protestants, men and women, clergy and commoners, were burned at the stake. It was a brutal, horrifying persecution. But it was also a political disaster. Burning people for their faith didn't crush Protestantism. It created martyrs. Famous churchmen like Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the architect of the English prayer book, and Bishops Latimer and Ridley were burned, their defiant last words becoming powerful Protestant propaganda. John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, which detailed the sufferings of the victims in lurid detail, became a bestseller and shaped English attitudes towards Catholicism for centuries. Mary also made a deeply unpopular marriage. She married Philip II, the King of Spain, the most powerful Catholic monarch in Europe. The English were deeply suspicious of this foreign marriage, fearing that England would become a mere satellite of Spain. To make matters worse, Mary failed to produce an heir. She had 2 phantom pregnancies, where she exhibited all the signs of being pregnant, but no baby ever appeared. It was a personal and dynastic tragedy. And then, to cap it all off, she was dragged into one of Philip's wars with France, and in the process, England lost Calais, its last remaining foothold on the continent, which it had held for over 200 years. It was a final, crushing humiliation. Mary died in 1558, a lonely, broken-hearted woman, convinced that she had failed in her divine mission. As she lay dying, she supposedly said, "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." The pendulum swung back again. The throne passed to the last of Henry VIII's children, his other daughter, the 25-year-old Anne Boleyn's girl, Elizabeth I. No one knew what to expect. She was a woman. She was the daughter of a disgraced and executed queen, and she had survived the treacherous politics of her brothers' and sisters' reigns by being incredibly clever, cautious, and keeping her own counsel. She had spent time imprisoned in the Tower under suspicion of treason during Mary's reign and had learned to be a political survivor. Her first challenge was religion. The country was a mess, swinging wildly between Protestantism and Catholicism. Elizabeth had to find a middle way. Her solution was the Elizabethan settlement. It was a classic English compromise. The Church of England would be Protestant in its doctrine, but it would retain some of the familiar structure and ceremony of the Old Church, like bishops and cathedrals. The monarch would be the supreme governor of the church, a slightly softer title than her father's supreme head. It was designed to be just Protestant enough for the Protestants and just Catholic-looking enough for the Catholics. It didn't please the hardliners on either side, the radical Puritans who wanted to abolish everything that smacked of popery, or the die-hard Catholics who still looked to Rome. But it pleased the vast majority in the middle. It was a policy of don't ask, don't tell. As long as you showed up to church and didn't cause trouble, the government wasn't too interested in what you actually believed in your heart. Elizabeth's other great challenge was marriage and succession. For 45 years, the question of who the queen would marry and who would succeed her dominated European politics. Parliament begged her to marry. Her advisors presented her with a parade of foreign princes and English noblemen. But Elizabeth prevaricated. She used the prospect of her hand in marriage as a diplomatic tool, playing one suitor off against another. She had a long, complicated, and probably romantic relationship with her childhood friend Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. But she could never marry him because of a scandal surrounding the suspicious death of his wife. In the end, she never married at all. She cultivated the image of the Virgin Queen, married only to her kingdom. It was a brilliant piece of personal branding that turned her greatest vulnerability, being a female ruler in a man's world, into her greatest strength. But the lack of an heir created a huge problem. The next in line to the throne was her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was Catholic, she had a son, James, and she had a strong claim to the English throne. For many English Catholics, she was the rightful queen, not the heretic Elizabeth. After a disastrous reign in Scotland which involved scandals, murder, and rebellion, Mary was forced to abdicate and flee. She sought refuge in England, throwing herself on her cousin Elizabeth's mercy. This put Elizabeth in an impossible position. She couldn't let Mary go free because she would just become the figurehead for a Catholic invasion. She couldn't execute her because she was an anointed queen and a cousin, so she did the only thing she could. She put Mary under house arrest for 19 years. For 19 years, Mary was a prisoner in England, and for 19 years, she was the focus of every Catholic plot to overthrow Elizabeth. Finally, Elizabeth's spymaster, the brilliant and ruthless Sir Francis Walsingham, uncovered a plot, the Babington plot, that directly implicated Mary in a plan to assassinate Elizabeth. Walsingham had the evidence. With a heavy heart, or at least a show of a heavy heart, Elizabeth signed her cousin's death warrant. In 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded. The execution of a Catholic queen infuriated Philip II of Spain. He had had enough of Elizabeth's Protestantism and her support for Dutch rebels fighting against Spanish rule. He was also sick of English privateers, sea dogs like Sir Francis Drake, who were plundering his treasure ships coming from the New World. In 1588, he assembled the greatest naval fleet the world had ever seen, the Spanish Armada. It was a massive invasion force designed to sail to the Netherlands, pick up a huge Spanish army, and then land in England and depose Elizabeth. On paper, England stood no chance. But the English had smaller, faster, more maneuverable ships with better long-range cannons, and they had the weather on their side. The English ships harried the vast Spanish crescent, and in the Battle of Gravelines, they used fire ships to break the Armada's formation. Then a massive storm, the Protestant wind, blew in, scattering the Spanish fleet and wrecking many of their ships on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. The Great Invasion had failed. It was a stunning, miraculous victory for England. It secured Elizabeth's throne, confirmed England's status as a major Protestant power, and created a powerful national myth. Elizabeth's long reign is often seen as a golden age. It was the age of Shakespeare and Marlowe, of Drake and Raleigh, of exploration and national self-confidence. But her final years were difficult. She was old, the country was weary from war, and she had outlived all her old friends and advisors. She became lonely and melancholic. She died in 1603, the last of the Tudor line. She had never named her successor, but everyone knew who it had to be. On her deathbed, she supposedly made a sign to indicate that she meant the King of Scotland. The man who would succeed her was James Stuart, the son of her executed cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. The Tudor cycle was over. The crowns of England and Scotland were finally united. A new family was in charge, and they were about to start a whole new cycle of trouble. The Stuarts. If the Tudors were masters of political theater, the Stuarts were a family who consistently misread the script and then tripped over the furniture. James I of England, who was already James VI of Scotland, was an intelligent and learned man. He was called the wisest fool in Christendom. He understood theology, he wrote books, but he had absolutely no understanding of England or the English. He had been King of Scotland since he was a baby, and he was used to a poor, fractious kingdom where the king's power was constantly challenged by powerful nobles. He came south to England expecting a land of milk and honey, a rich and compliant kingdom. What he found was a kingdom with a rich and compliant parliament that was getting increasingly uppity about its own rights. James was a firm believer in the divine right of kings. He believed that kings were chosen by God and were answerable only to God. Parliament, he thought, was just an advisory body that he could summon or dismiss as he pleased. Parliament, on the other hand, believed that it had the right to control taxation and to have a say in the government of the country. This was the central conflict that would dominate the 17th century, king versus parliament. It was the old king versus barons cycle, but updated and given a constitutional gloss. James also had other problems. He was physically awkward and had a thick Scottish accent that the English court found uncouth. And, like Edward II, he had a clear preference for handsome young male favorites, lavishing titles and power on men like Robert Carr and, most famously, George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. This did not endear him to the English nobility. Almost immediately, he faced a Catholic conspiracy, the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. A group of Catholic extremists, led by Robert Catesby and including a man named Guy Fawkes, planned to blow up the entire political establishment, the King, the Lords, and the Commons, at the state opening of Parliament. They packed dozens of barrels of gunpowder into a cellar underneath the House of Lords. The plot was discovered at the last minute. Guy Fawkes was found guarding the gunpowder, and the conspirators were rounded up and brutally executed. The failure of the plot is still celebrated in Britain every November 5th with bonfires and fireworks, a national celebration of a narrowly averted terrorist attack. James managed to muddle through his reign without a complete breakdown, largely by avoiding major wars and by lecturing Parliament constantly on his divine right to do whatever he wanted. He sponsored a new translation of the Bible into English, the King James Version, which would become one of the most influential books in the English language. But he left his son a legacy of debt, a powerful and unpopular favorite in the Duke of Buckingham, and a deeply unresolved conflict with Parliament. His son Charles I was a disaster waiting to happen. Where James was slobbish and talkative, Charles was dignified, reserved, and principled. He was also rigid, arrogant, and completely incapable of compromise. He was a man of exquisite taste in art, but he had the political instincts of a lemming. He believed in the divine right of kings even more fervently than his father had, but he lacked his father's pragmatism. He saw any opposition from Parliament not as a political disagreement, but as a personal insult and an act of rebellion. The first few years of his reign were a series of escalating conflicts with Parliament over money and religion. Charles wanted money for his wars, pushed by Buckingham, and Parliament wouldn't give it to him unless he addressed their grievances. In 1628, they forced him to accept the Petition of Right, a document that restated the traditional rights of Englishmen, including the right not to be taxed without Parliament's consent. Charles agreed to it and then promptly ignored it. The next year, after a furious session where the Speaker of the House of Commons was physically held down in his chair to prevent him from adjourning the session, Charles had had enough. He dissolved Parliament and decided to rule on his own. For the next 11 years, from 1629 to 1640, Charles ruled without a parliament. This period is known as the personal rule, or the 11 Years' Tyranny, depending on your point of view. To raise money, he resorted to all sorts of archaic and unpopular methods, like ship money, a tax that coastal towns had traditionally paid for naval defense in times of war, which Charles now levied on the entire country in peacetime. He also pursued a religious policy that infuriated the Puritans. His Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, tried to impose more ritual and ceremony on the Church of England, reintroducing things that looked suspiciously like Catholic practices. The Puritans saw this as a creeping return to popery. The whole thing blew up in his face when he tried to impose a new English-style prayer book on Scotland. The Scots were fiercely Presbyterian. They saw this as an attack on their national church and their national identity. They rebelled. In 1638, thousands of Scots signed a national covenant, pledging to defend their religion. The Bishops' Wars followed. Charles's attempts to crush the Scottish rebellion were a shambles. He didn't have the money or the army to do it. Finally, in 1640, humiliated and broke, he was forced to do the one thing he had avoided for 11 years. He had to summon Parliament. The Parliament that met in 1640 was not in a forgiving mood. Led by fiery MPs like John Pym, they were determined to dismantle the machinery of Charles's personal rule once and for all. This Parliament, which would become known as the Long Parliament, immediately went on the attack. They had the king's chief advisors, Archbishop Laud and the Earl of Strafford, arrested and impeached for treason. Strafford was executed. They passed a triennial act requiring Parliament to be summoned at least once every 3 years. They abolished the prerogative courts like the Star Chamber and declared taxes like ship money illegal. Charles, powerless, was forced to agree to all of it, but the relationship had broken down completely. Trust was gone. A rebellion broke out in Ireland, and the question of who should control the army raised to suppress it became the final sticking point. Parliament didn't trust the king with an army, and the king wouldn't surrender his military authority. In January 1642, Charles made his final, fatal mistake. Convinced that 5 of his leading opponents in the House of Commons were guilty of treason, he decided to arrest them himself. He marched to the House of Commons with 400 soldiers and entered the chamber, something no monarch had ever done. But the 5 members, having been tipped off, had already fled. Charles looked around the chamber and asked the speaker where they were. The speaker, William Lenthal, fell to his knees and uttered the immortal words, "May it please your majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the House is pleased to direct me." The king had been publicly defied. He had failed. He left the chamber, humiliated. London erupted in support of Parliament. Charles fled the city. The time for talking was over. The English Civil War had begun. The country was divided. It was not a neat division of class or geography, though generally the more economically advanced southeast sided with Parliament, and the more rural north and west sided with the king. It was a war of cavaliers, the long-haired, dashing royalist supporters, against roundheads, the Puritan parliamentarians, so called for their plain, short haircuts. For the first couple of years, the war was inconclusive. The royalists had better cavalry, but Parliament had London and the Navy. The tide turned when Parliament created a new professional fighting force, the New Model Army. It was a national army, not a collection of local militias. Its soldiers were well-equipped, well-paid, mostly, and ideologically motivated, and it was led by brilliant commanders like Sir Thomas Fairfax and a backbench MP and gentleman farmer turned cavalry genius named Oliver Cromwell. At the battles of Marston Moor in 1644 and Naseby in 1645, the New Model Army crushed the royalist forces. Charles I surrendered, not to Parliament but to the Scots, hoping to play them off against the English. It didn't work. The Scots eventually handed him over to Parliament for a fee. But the war wasn't over. The victors, Parliament, the army, and the Scots, now started arguing among themselves about what to do next. The army, which had become a hotbed of radical political and religious ideas, grew increasingly suspicious of the more conservative Parliament. Charles, ever the opportunist, tried to exploit these divisions. He escaped from custody and made a secret deal with the Scots, promising to impose Presbyterianism on England in exchange for their help. This started the Second Civil War. The army was furious. They had won the war, and now the king was starting it all over again. They quickly crushed the Royalist and Scottish uprisings, and this time they had had enough of Charles. The army, now the dominant power in the land, decided that the king, the man of blood, must be brought to justice. In December 1648, they staged a military coup. Colonel Thomas Pride stood at the door of the House of Commons and arrested or excluded all the MPs who were still willing to negotiate with the king. This event, Pride's Purge, left behind a small, radical rump of MPs who were willing to do the army's bidding. This rump parliament voted to put the king on trial for treason. The trial of Charles I in January 1649 was unprecedented. A king had never been put on trial by his own subjects. Charles refused to recognize the legitimacy of the court. He refused to enter a plea. He argued with considerable dignity that as their lawful king, they had no right to try him. But the verdict was a foregone conclusion. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. On January 30th, 1649, Charles I was led out onto a scaffold built outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. He wore 2 shirts so that he would not shiver in the cold and have the crowd think he was afraid. He gave a short speech, put his head on the block, and was executed with a single blow of the axe. A groan of horror went up from the vast crowd. The cycle of conflict between king and subject had reached its terrifying bloody climax. The monarchy was abolished. England was declared a commonwealth, a republic. So they did it. They killed the king. They got rid of the monarchy. Problem solved, right? Wrong. The next 11 years, the interregnum, or the time between reigns, proved that getting rid of a king was a lot easier than figuring out what to replace him with. The rump parliament governed, but the real power was the army, and the real power in the army was Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was a complex figure, a devout Puritan who believed he was doing God's work. He was also a brilliant general and a ruthless politician. He led the New Model Army on brutal campaigns to suppress rebellion in Ireland and Scotland. Campaigns that were notorious for their massacres and left a legacy of bitterness that lasts to this day. Back in England, the Rump Parliament seemed incapable of creating a stable new government. In 1653, Cromwell, frustrated with their endless talking, did what he did best. He used soldiers. He marched into the House of Commons, just as Charles I had done, but this time he succeeded. He dismissed the MPs, famously shouting, "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing lately. In the name of God, go." For the next 5 years, England was effectively a military dictatorship under Cromwell, who was given the title Lord Protector. He was offered the crown, but he refused it. He was king in all but name. He enforced a strict Puritan morality on the country, closing theaters and banning Christmas celebrations. It was not a popular regime. When Cromwell died in 1558, his protectorate crumbled. His son, Richard Cromwell, tried to succeed him, but had none of his father's authority. The country, tired of military rule and Puritan austerity, yearned for a return to the old ways. In 1660, the army commander in Scotland, General George Monk, marched his army to London, recalled the Long Parliament, and engineered a political solution. An election was held for a new Convention Parliament, and its first act was to invite the exiled son of the executed king to return. In May 1660, Charles II, who had been wandering around Europe for years, landed at Dover to ecstatic crowds. The monarchy was restored. The entire bloody, traumatic Republican experiment was over. They had gone through civil war, regicide, and military dictatorship, only to end up right back where they started, with a Stuart king on the throne. The cycle had come full circle, proving that the English at that point hated kings, but they hated not having a king even more. The restoration was a collective sigh of relief. Charles II was the polar opposite of his father. He was cynical, witty, and charming. His primary interests were his mistresses, he had many, and his spaniels, he had even more. He was determined not to go on his travels again. His reign was a reaction against the grim Puritan years. Theaters reopened, and a new, bawdy style of restoration comedy flourished. The court was famous for its glamour and its promiscuity, but underneath the party atmosphere, the old problems hadn't gone away. The relationship between king and parliament was still tense, especially over money and religion. Charles was secretly sympathetic to Catholicism, and his brother and heir, James, was an open and avowed Catholic. This terrified the Protestant political establishment. Parliament tried to pass an exclusion bill to exclude James from the succession. This led to a major political crisis, the Exclusion Crisis, which saw the birth of England's first political parties: the Whigs, who wanted to exclude James, and the Tories, who supported the hereditary right of the king. Charles, using all his political skill and a secret subsidy from the King of France, managed to defeat the exclusion bill. He ruled the last few years of his life without parliament, just as his father had done. On his deathbed, he was received into the Catholic Church. He died in 1685, leaving the throne to the one person Parliament had tried so hard to stop: his Catholic brother. James II was as tactless and stubborn as Charles II had been flexible and charming. He was determined to promote Catholicism in England. He appointed Catholics to high office in the army, the universities, and the government, in direct violation of the law. He issued a declaration of indulgence, granting religious freedom to Catholics and Protestant dissenters, which sounded nice, but was seen by many as a cynical attempt to use the dissenters to help the Catholics. He was acting like an absolute monarch, ignoring Parliament and dispensing with laws he didn't like. It was Charles I all over again, but with more rosary beads. For a few years, the political establishment held its breath. James was getting old, and his heirs were his two Protestant daughters from his first marriage, Mary and Anne. They could just wait him out. And then, in 1688, the unthinkable happened. James's second wife, the Catholic Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son, a healthy Catholic male heir. Suddenly, the prospect of a permanent Catholic dynasty loomed. The story even spread that the baby wasn't real, that it was a changeling smuggled into the Queen's bed in a warming pan. The Protestant establishment panicked. In secret, a group of 7 leading Whig and Tory politicians did something unprecedented. They wrote a letter to the leading Protestant prince in Europe, William of Orange. William was the head of the Dutch Republic, the great rival to Louis XIV's France. And conveniently, he was married to James II's eldest daughter, Mary. They invited William to come to England with an army to save the Protestant religion and English liberties. William, who needed England as an ally in his fight against France, saw his chance. In November 1688, he landed in England with a large army. It was a massive gamble, but it paid off. James II's support melted away. His army deserted, his other daughter Anne sided with William, and even his most trusted general, John Churchill, the future Duke of Marlborough, switched sides. James II lost his nerve, tried to flee, was captured, and then was conveniently allowed to escape to France. This was the Glorious Revolution. It was glorious because it was almost entirely bloodless. A king had been overthrown, but this time there was no civil war. Parliament met, and after some debate declared that James II, by fleeing the country, had abdicated the throne. They then offered the crown jointly to William and Mary, but there was a condition. Before they were crowned, they had to accept a document called the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights of 1689 was the final act in the long drama of king versus parliament. It settled the constitutional questions that had plagued the country for a century. It stated that the king could not suspend laws, levy taxes, or maintain a standing army without parliament's consent. It guaranteed regular parliaments, free elections, and freedom of speech within parliament. It barred any Catholic from ever inheriting the throne. The cycle was finally broken. Or rather, it had been tamed. The monarchy would survive, but it would now be a constitutional monarchy, its power limited by law and by parliament. Never again would an English monarch try to rule as an absolute sovereign. The partnership of crown and parliament that defines the British system of government had been forged. And so the cycle begins to break, or rather, transform. The era of the monarch as the central driving force of the state is over. The 18th century sees the rise of the prime minister and cabinet government. The monarch is still important, but their power is steadily ebbing away, flowing towards the politicians in parliament. The Hanoverian dynasty, which takes over after the last Stuart, Queen Anne, dies childless in 1714, accelerates this process. The first Hanoverian king, George I, was a German prince from Hanover who was invited to be king because he was the closest Protestant relative of Queen Anne. He spoke no English and was far more interested in his German electorate than in Britain. He was happy to let his ministers run the country, particularly the brilliant, cynical, and incredibly long-serving Whig politician, Sir Robert Walpole, who is now considered Britain's first prime minister. The pattern continues with his son, George II. He was another German-speaking king who was more at home on the battlefields of Europe than in the corridors of Westminster. He was the last British monarch to personally lead his troops into battle at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. But while he was off playing soldier, the politicians back home were consolidating their power. The great threat of the early Hanoverian period was the Jacobites, the supporters of the exiled Stuart claimant James II's son, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, and later his grandson, Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, or the Young Pretender. There were two major Jacobite rebellions in 1715 and 1745. The 45, led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, was the more serious. He landed in Scotland, raised an army of Highland clans, and marched south, getting as far as Derby, only 100 miles from London. But the English did not rise to support him, and he was forced to retreat. His army was brutally crushed by the Duke of Cumberland's forces at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. Culloden was the last battle fought on British soil, and it was followed by a ruthless suppression of Highland culture. The Jacobite threat was extinguished forever. The cycle of contested succession was finally truly over. The next king, George III, was a new kind of Hanoverian. He was the first to be born in England and to speak English as his first language. "Born and educated in this country," he declared, "I glory in the name of Britain." He was a decent, hard-working, and deeply conservative man who wanted to be a good king. He was also determined to reassert some of the royal authority that his grandfather and great-grandfather had let slip. He tried to rule more directly, choosing his own ministers rather than just accepting the choices of the dominant parliamentary faction. This led to years of political instability, but his reign is remembered for two things above all: losing America and losing his mind. The American Revolution was a complex affair, but from the British perspective, it was a dispute over taxation and representation. The British government, deep in debt after a long and expensive war with France, the 7 Years' War, thought it was reasonable for the American colonists to help pay for their own defense. The colonists, who had no representatives in the British Parliament, disagreed, famously chanting, "No taxation without representation." The conflict escalated, from protests to boycotts to the Boston Tea Party to outright war. In 1776, the colonies declared their independence. Despite a long and bitter war, Britain was unable to subdue the rebellion, especially after France, Spain, and the Netherlands joined in on the American side. The loss of the American colonies was a stunning blow to British prestige and a personal humiliation for George III. Later in his reign, George began to suffer from bouts of severe mental illness. We now think it was probably a genetic disorder called porphyria. He would become manic, talk for hours without stopping, and suffer from delusions. The madness of King George triggered another political crisis, as politicians argued over who should rule as regent. He would recover for periods, but the illness always returned. For the last decade of his life, he was completely blind, deaf, and lost in a world of his own, a sad, lonely figure wandering the halls of Windsor Castle. The monarchy had become a symbol of pathos. His son, George IV, who had served as Prince Regent during his father's final illness, was a stark contrast. Where George III was frugal and dutiful, George IV was extravagant, selfish, and obsessed with fashion and art. He was the man in the corset from the beginning of our story. He had great taste. He was responsible for the beautiful royal pavilion in Brighton and the remodeling of Buckingham Palace, but he was a personal and political disaster. He had a secret, illegal marriage to a Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert, before being forced into an official, disastrous marriage with his German cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. He hated her on sight. They had one daughter and then lived apart. When he became king, he tried to divorce Caroline and prevent her from being crowned queen. The Queen Caroline affair became a massive public scandal, with the common people overwhelmingly taking Caroline's side against the deeply unpopular king. George IV's reign showed the monarchy at its most decadent and disconnected. It was a PR nightmare. His short-lived successor, his brother William IV, was a slight improvement. He was an eccentric ex-sailor known as Sailor Bill, but he was more down-to-earth and presided over a period of major political reform, most notably the Great Reform Act of 1832, which began the process of modernizing Britain's archaic electoral system. But when he died in 1837, the Hanoverian line seemed exhausted. The monarchy's reputation was in the gutter. It seemed to be drifting towards irrelevance. And then came Victoria. She was William's niece, only 18 years old when she came to the throne. No one expected much from her, but she would go on to reign for 63 years, the longest reign in British history up to that point, and she would redefine the monarchy for the modern age. The key to her success was her marriage to her German cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Albert was intelligent, hardworking, and deeply serious. He saw that for the monarchy to survive in an age of democracy and industrialization, it had to change. It could no longer be a source of political power or factional strife. It had to become a symbol of national unity, morality, and family values. Together, Victoria and Albert created a new model of monarchy. They had 9 children, and they presented themselves to the public as the ideal, respectable, middle-class family. This was a radical departure from the scandalous Hanoverian courts of her uncles. The monarchy became associated with domesticity, duty, and public service. When Albert died prematurely in 1861, Victoria was utterly devastated. She went into a deep mourning from which she never fully emerged, wearing black for the rest of her life and withdrawing from public life for many years. But even in her seclusion, she remained a powerful symbol. She became the grandmother of Europe, with her children and grandchildren marrying into almost every royal house on the continent, and she became the figurehead of the vast British Empire, which reached its peak during her reign. The monarchy had found its new role, not to rule, but to reign, to be a symbol, a focus for national identity in a rapidly changing world. The political cycle had been broken, replaced by a cycle of public perception, media image, and symbolic duty. The 20th century saw this new model of monarchy tested by war, social change, and the rise of mass media. Victoria's son, Edward VII, was the polar opposite of his father Albert. He was a pleasure-loving bon vivant who had waited decades to become king. But he proved to be a surprisingly popular and effective monarch, his diplomatic efforts helping to pave the way for the Anglo-French Entente. His son, George V, was a bluff, straightforward former naval officer who guided the country through the trauma of the First World War. It was George V who, in 1917, amid anti-German sentiment, changed the family name from the German-sounding Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the very English-sounding House of Windsor. He was a reassuringly solid and dependable figure, the first monarch to use the radio to broadcast a Christmas message to the empire, creating a new sense of connection with his subjects. The first major crisis for the modern monarchy came in 1936. George V died and was succeeded by his charismatic, popular eldest son, Edward VIII. But Edward was in love with a twice-divorced American woman, Wallis Simpson. In the 1930s, the idea of the king, the supreme governor of the Church of England, marrying a divorcee was unthinkable. The government, the church, and the dominions were all opposed. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, told Edward he had a choice. He could give up Mrs. Simpson, or he could give up the throne. In a decision that shocked the world, Edward chose love. After reigning for less than a year, he abdicated, declaring in a famous radio broadcast that he could not carry the heavy burden of responsibility and discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. The crown passed to his shy, stammering younger brother, Albert, who took the name George VI to provide a sense of continuity with his father. The abdication was a constitutional earthquake, but the monarchy survived, largely thanks to the quiet dignity and sense of duty of George VI and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother. George VI had to overcome a debilitating speech impediment, as dramatized in the film The King's Speech, to become the reassuring voice of the nation during the dark days of the Second World War. He and the Queen refused to leave London during the Blitz, famously declaring that their children would not leave without them. They would not leave without the king, and the king would never leave. Their steadfastness during the war immeasurably strengthened the bond between the monarchy and the people. When George VI died in 1952, the throne passed to his 25-year-old daughter, Elizabeth II. Her coronation in 1953 was the first to be televised, a global media event that seemed to herald a new, modern Elizabethan age. Her long reign has seen more change than that of any of her predecessors. The final dismantling of the British Empire, the rise of the permissive society, the advent of the digital age, and a complete transformation in the relationship between public figures and the media. The cycle of the monarchy is no longer about succession crises or wars with France. It is about navigating the relentless glare of the 24/7 news cycle. The royal family's personal lives have become a national and international soap opera. The fairy tale wedding of Prince Charles to Lady Diana Spencer in 1981 was followed by their bitter public separation and divorce, the War of the Waleses. Diana's tragic death in a car crash in 1997 provoked an unprecedented outpouring of public grief and a rare moment of crisis for the Queen, who was seen by many as being too remote and unfeeling in her initial response. The marriages, divorces, and scandals of the Queen's children and grandchildren have been played out on the front pages of tabloids around the world. The monarchy has had its annus horribilis, as the Queen famously described the year 1992, which saw a fire at Windsor Castle and the separation of 3 of her children. It has faced controversies over its funding, its relevance, and its future. And yet, it endures. Why? Why does this ancient, irrational, inherited institution persist in a modern democratic age? The reflection on the cycle gives us a clue. Nobody ever really learned. Or rather, what they learned was that the alternative was often worse. The chaos of the anarchy led to the stability of Henry II. The tyranny of John led to the principles of Magna Carta. The bloody wars of the Roses led to the boring, peaceful accountancy of Henry VII. The regicide of Charles I led to the military dictatorship of Cromwell, which in turn led to the joyful restoration of Charles II. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 wasn't really a revolution at all. It was a conservative coup designed to preserve the existing system by replacing one king with another, more compliant one. The pattern is one of crisis followed by a pragmatic, messy compromise that papers over the cracks and allows the show to go on. The monarchy has survived because it has adapted. It has shed its real political power while retaining its immense symbolic power. It has transformed from a system of government into a system of national identity and historical continuity. The monarch is no longer the chief executive of the nation, but its chief mascot. They are the living embodiment of the state, a human link to 1,000 years of history, from William the Conqueror's smoke-filled coronation to the televised spectacles of today. The cycle has not been broken so much as it has been tamed and domesticated. The brutal struggles for power have been replaced by struggles for good press. The succession is no longer decided by battles, but by birth order, and its dramas are played out in gossip magazines. So, what is the lesson of this long, sprawling, often ridiculous story? Perhaps it is that institutions are more resilient than the flawed human beings who inhabit them. For every Henry V, there is a Henry VI. For every Elizabeth I, there is a Charles I. The institution survives its best and its worst occupants. Or perhaps the lesson is that the British people have a deep-seated love of tradition, pageantry, and a good old-fashioned family drama, especially when it involves people in fancy hats. The monarchy has become the ultimate reality show, and we have been watching for 1,000 years. And in the end, we find ourselves back where we started, with George IV sweating in his corset, He is the perfect symbol for the whole enterprise. He is a man being forced into a shape that no longer quite fits, a symbol of ancient dignity struggling with the messy, uncomfortable reality of being human. The crown is placed on his head. The ceremony is completed. He is the anointed king, and he has spent a fortune on the party. The British monarchy, in all its absurdity and all its splendor, lives to fight another day, or more likely to open another hospital, to christen another ship, and to provide endless fodder for the newspapers. The cycle continues, not with the clash of swords, but with the flash of cameras. And you get the feeling that somewhere William the Conqueror, a man who understood power, control, and good accounting, would look at the sheer endurance of the brand he created and allow himself a grim, satisfied smile. It was a hell of a hostile takeover, and somehow, against all odds, the company is still in business.